Welcome to the Milkshake Show, a spike concoction blending together the latest Web3 news, stories, trends, and insights. I'm Christopher Schoenwald, podcaster, entrepreneur, educator, and let me toss it over to my co-host, Mr. Alvin Fu.
Well, I'm Alvin Fu, a VC, partnering in crime with Chris. We're working on the show, and I'd like to welcome Dez on the show. I'll pass it to Dez.
Guys, thanks for having me here. I feel somewhat left out that I don't have the milkshake background now.
Yeah, really excited to have you on. I mean, for obvious reasons here, just going to take a second here in this first segment, the ice, some cold hard facts about our guest. So let me just introduce you really quickly here, Dez, and then you can feel free to add anything afterwards. But in terms of Dez Blanchfield, strategic leader in business, digital transformation, over 35 years in the IT and telecommunications industry, developing strategy, and implementing business initiatives. He's also the CEO of several different companies, and he's worked in almost every industry you can imagine. Let me just list off a few for you here. Defense, banking, finance, health, education, media and publishing, airports and aviation, transport, logistics, telecommunications, energy, utilities, federal and state government. Yes, it's a bit of a mouthful there, I must say that, but
it ages me terribly as well.
Yeah. And outside of that, I mean, in terms of some of the stuff he's involved with, specialty, I guess you would say, would be digital disruption, digital transformation, cloud computing, edge computing, networking, big data and analytics, artificial intelligence. That's a big one right now, obviously. Machine intelligence, Internet of Things, and several other aspects within the digital realm. Did I leave anything out there? Did I get it all?
There's a lot there. What it does is ages me terribly, and it does sound like a lot, but at the grand old age of 55, I've had a few jobs and I've run a few companies, and a lot of trends have come and gone, and I do my best to see those trends early and get on top of them and leverage them in various ways, and then look for the next one on the horizon.
Yeah, nice. Well, I love it all. I mean, this is our, just to be frank, this is our first episode for Alvin and I in terms of having or welcoming a guest onto the program. And one of the reasons I'm really excited about it is just that. I mean, it's this comprehensive background. Like, you've had your hands in just about everything. And I think it's a perfect sort of entry into all of this. And maybe you could slide into this next segment, actually, the creamy and smooth details. We've got these goofy sort of segment titles here for you. But, we'd love to know what's consuming your time right now. We're just speaking about all these different interests that you have in consulting in all these different areas. But at the moment, like right now, what is it that you're involved in?
So right now, there are two things that are really consuming all of my time. And I let's separate all between family time and work time. I'll focus on work time. Family time is, I'm a real stickler for family time, and I don't break that rule for any other reason than maybe an emergency. So right now, there are two things that are taking my time. The most obvious one for most people is recovering from the last 3 years. Looking at how do we look at the last 3 years and not just learn from that, but also recover. I mean, there's a lot of revenue that's gone through the cracks in the floor. For some of our companies, people just locked up their spending. For other companies, they discontinued marketing communications because the optics weren't right. And then there was immediate, impacts to things like, companies having to shut down their physical environments and move to e-commerce and so forth. So the last 3 years have created this fairly large hole in effectively our annual recurring revenue that we're having to rebuild. The second thing that's taking my time is to effectively, leading up to the end of last year, I made the hard decision to effectively burn to the ground everything that I had and Phoenix it. So I didn't wash it out, flush it down the toilet and so forth and lose the baby with the dishwater. But what that meant was I took a series of companies and restructured the way they work and Phoenix them from sort of, this curious last 3 years that, where, and keeping in mind the pandemic's not over. I mean, a lot of companies are sort of at the point where they're trying to pretend that is the case. It isn't over, but obviously governments have had to bring people back to work, and they've had to open up again their borders because we couldn't just stay in lockdown forever. And the variants have become less and less deadly. So the first part is really just looking at that recovery and rebuild of how do we go back to sort of, if we think about the revenue of 2018, 2019, and frame that and look at how do we get back to that by the end of this year and use this as a recovery year, and maybe just look back at the end of this year and go, okay, there was 3 years that were just a garish nightmare. We can sort of hopefully move past. That's really the big part. And as I said, the second part is then look at, where do we go from here with phoenixing the businesses? So I have 4 companies in the process of effectively exiting and in some cases cashing out and selling. In other cases, we're basically taking the IP and just, as I said, burning them to the ground and just, getting rid of the bits we don't need. and in the process of launching 5 new companies around that. So the idea will be between now and the end of this year to have a network of 10 companies that are effectively a closed loop around what we're doing in all things, in all avenues, whether it's content creation, publishing, promotion, and technical advisory. So yeah, a lot of good fun. It's keeping me up at night, but it's very exciting. And in one case, I have a company that hasn't even had a website for 9 years, hasn't need to. We're launching a website for it, which is pretty simple but exciting.
Nice. Alvin, do you have any follow-ups on that?
How do you now? Yes. How do you manage now? How do you burn them all to the ground, right, and then build another 5 companies, right? How do you?
Good question.
Starting up is not easy, right? Starting up is already very hard. Starting 5, that's a mountain to scale. I'd love to hear how do you do start 5 companies.
So towards the end of the last year, I was running 9 businesses in various forms. Some were in traditional business and tech consulting. At the other end of the spectrum, there was one which was effectively in B2B influencer marketing, which is more of a publishing firm. So the simple answer to that in 30 seconds is to look at the organization and see where it's making money and what makes that money work, and where it's not making money, and to basically just kill those off. That's really the key part of taking any organization and burning it to the ground. Restarting it is pretty straightforward. It's the inverse of that, which is looking at what was making money and scale it up and do more of that. It's actually fairly simple. There's a lot of administrative overhead there. So in one case, I've taken a business and broken it up, and I've shelved the regional trading entity, and I've taken out 4 parts and created 4 new firms around it, plus added one at the end to help manage it. And those 5 organizations basically become their own first client. They work with each other to get up and running. Then I become the first customer for them. So, for example, one of those is a podcasting business. So instead of having a business unit that was podcasting in the original firm last year, when we broke it up, that business unit became a company of its own right, becoming a podcast production company, as we did with written content and podcast content, video content, film content, and event activation, and so forth. So breaking up those business units and launching them as separate little businesses, moving the revenue that was related to them into those companies rather than keeping them inside a business unit itself. It's actually quite simple on paper. It's a little bit of juggling to move things around, and then you've obviously got to go back to some of the customers and let them know that you're going to now be billing them under a different name. Sometimes you have to fill in new forms to become a standard supplier again. Most people don't. They just simply need a letter from you describing what it is. But how do you do it? It's a lot of time and effort. So the number one thing that I advise people to do is build the best team they can afford around them to do that. So when I say that I'm doing this, it's the royal we. It's a team around me, So, and I operate a virtual team, and I think Alvin, you and I spoke about this before offline. So I don't have a CFO in every company. There's one CFO function, and that person sits inside an accounting firm, and that I own a chunk of that accounting firm, enough to help grow and direct it. And I become the first customer for that. And so when you think about, by the end of this year, I'll have 10 companies. There's a virtual CFO across all those companies that provides that function with, lines in the sand between the knowledge and reporting between them. So I don't have this massive overhead. I have one core group of people around me that support that. So that speeds things up. But yeah, I one of the first things I learned years ago when I was sort of like late in my teens and started my first software company, and my dad advised me, he's like, spend every cent you've got on the best people you can afford, and then get out of their way and let them make you money.
Yeah, great points there. And also too, like when you're speaking about that point, like we're going to shift and do a new segment really quickly here. But before we do so, I mean, what struck me there is like this idea of synergy. Synergy between these companies, synergy in terms of the strategies and how you can sort of like work these companies together, and in effect allow you to kind of like separate and have these companies doing their own thing. But I think that also speaks to the point of this digital age that we're within. Like I would wonder, it could be a whole different podcast into itself, like if that has been facilitated with the rise of this digital world that we're living within, like
absolutely.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that's a trend. It's
enabled it, right? Absolutely, it's enabled. I mean, so for example, we have one environment that's shared by everything. So think about it as kind of like a micro hedge fund that underpins a virtual VC platform that does nothing but build my companies and all that shared environment. So things like just hosting domain names, hosting mail accounts, cloud services, and all the interconnected stuff. So, we don't have one Zoom account on every company. There's a common Zoom account, and they all share that for video stuff, and we do the other services as well. And so when we think about the transitions from Web 1.0, as it were, in that speak, a long time ago, some of this wouldn't be possible. It'd be very expensive, very slow, clunky. Web 2.0 was a bit more possible. Web 3.0 now has completely changed the game. So, even to the point where none of these companies have a physical office, not one of them. Right? And 99% of the people that work inside the group, and there's over 300 people across the whole group. And in fact, I launched an investment vehicle called Promereon Group to sort of puddle us under rather than sit inside a family trust. And there's about 300 people around the world that are part of that, either part-time, full-time, gig working, whatever. And they are all over the world. It's a fascinating. Often we'll have to do 2 or 3 calls a day just to do a sync up once a month, which is really exciting. And a lot of what you're talking about with sort of the new digital tools, digital capabilities, means that we can do things like, if I want to get an article written, I can actually put that article out into different platforms and offer people $50 a shot at it and spend $500 finding 10 people to write it, and then just pick the best 3 and publish the best one out of those 3, but then employ all 3 because I like all their work. And I can keep the other 2 I didn't publish and rework them later. So, it's so much easier with tools today to do that than it might have been, say, 10 or 15 years ago, to the point where even doing a conference call on voice was a nightmare to set up, whereas now I just flick them an email with the URL and they click on it. So you're absolutely right. I mean, there are so many things now that make all of this faster, leaner, cheaper, easier, and a lot more fun, which is the most important part.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you have these moments every now and then where you're like, we are living in the future, like right now. Yeah. Right now in this moment, right? Like it hits you. And I was just listening to you there. I mean, it struck me again. But anyway, on the heels of that conversation and what we're just speaking about there, I would like to slide into this next segment, the spike. It's basically a love them, hate them for Web3 trends. And there's a lot going on these days. So I'll let you take it where you want to go, the love or the hate first. But what would you say to that there, Dez?
Yeah, buckle up. So when we were off the air, I mentioned that I'd had 2 death threats in the last 3 days. And I get a lot of that hate when I lay out stuff that seems very black and white and crystal clear to me, where a lot of people drink the Kool-Aid and they get so obsessed with it, they don't stop and take a deep breath and step back and go, have I done a lemming jumping off the cliff and now I just have to hang on for dear life? So there are a lot of things that I'm really excited about that are coming about. For example, the whole concept of, and I'm really careful to use terms like Web 3.0 because they are just silly coinages that media personalities create to describe nothing things. But the current state of the world that is effectively referred to as 3.0, this whole concept of distributed things, even distributed things have been around for a long time. But the way it's being done now, it means that we can almost start with nothing and build the version 1 overnight and actually make a minimal viral product. So I get very excited about the fact that I can take an idea, particularly if it's somebody I've seen out there. For example, Alvin, if you and I were talking about something in any scenario, I've had scenarios where I'm in a business lounge in an airport somewhere, and I will talk to one of you guys and just get to know you and have a chat. And before we get on the plane, we're exchanging contact details because I'll turn and say, I'd like to put some money on the table and start a project with you. And if nothing else, I'll help you build a company, and I'll retain 25% when we get off the ground. I'll take another 24% over the next 3 years as we build this thing, and then I'll basically cash out. And I may only cash out for a couple $100,000. I don't want to build $1 billion company. What I want to do is take the idea you had and help it get a life and make available all things that I have at my fingertips to do that, because a lot of people don't know how to build that business. And then effectively put a protective bubble around you and saying, you just focus on being the best you can in the world at that, and we'll take it to the market and see what happens. And we may only get 3 to 5 customers in the first couple of years, but that's enough to bootstrap and self-fund and get you up and running and to build a team around you. So I'm really excited about that. I'm less excited about some of the mega hype that happens with things like blockchain. I think we're so far down the path now with blockchain that if you put 10 people in a room and ask them to describe blockchain, you get 43 different versions, and not one of them would be correct. I remember there was a high school thing, and I'm sure you guys did it. There was a high school thing where your teacher would line you all up, back to front, back to front. You'd face, one person would face the chalkboard or the whiteboard in today's speak, and you'd all line up one behind the other. I would face your back and someone else would face someone else's back. and somebody would start at the back and get a piece of paper and write something on that person's back, and the next person interpret it. And it'd get to the point where 5 or 6 or 10 or 20, 30 people, at the end, someone had to write on the chalkboard or the whiteboard what they thought it was. And it would never match, but it was scary how quickly it got out of sync with reality to the point where even the first person could barely describe it. And I think a lot of these things where distributed ledger concepts aren't new. It's just the way we're doing it. We've had distributed databases for decades and decades. In fact, the very second iteration of databases were distributed. That was the whole point of it. Have a primary database and a backup copy. And then they went from active-passive to active-active, and there was redundancy. To do it into a distributed ledger form in the way that blockchain does is great. But it's one of those things where it was a solution looking for a problem, and it took a couple of years to find the problem that it was actually suited to. So I'm not excited about that, because billions of dollars gets wasted on trying to find a problem for that solution. And sometimes people talk about things like, running a blockchain on a mainframe, for example. Well, mainframes have had that kind of thing for banking for decades, and they're purpose-built for that. Running a blockchain on a mainframe is just dumb. It's a centralized single database server. But having a DLT on my mobile phone with IPFS, genius, and I want it, and I use it every day. So I'm really careful about what I like from a technology point of view and see a fit for purpose need for it versus things that are just batshit crazy and billions are being wasted on them for no other reason than people can get someone to invest in it and make a bit of capital and spin it.
Right. Des, do you really believe in a world? I mean, we chatted about this before, right? Do you believe in a world where the believer of Web3 actually believe that the world will go towards fully decentralized? What's your view? What's your take on that? Do you think that is going to be a version that is going to be on that extreme, or the world moving forward is going to be still very centralized? And what's your thought on this?
I like it.
Yeah, so you have to do it on a use case by use case, right? So if you go back 15,000 years ago, when humans were still fairly young in the formation of humanoids, and we lived in villages, and there were hunter-gatherers running around with spears on one side, and there were gardeners running around picking things up the ground or digging them out of the ground and creating food, and they traded. The concept of the distributed world already happened. People moved around, they're nomadic, they traded information, they traded knowledge, they traded stories. We look at today, and I think the distraction we have is that everybody thinks that technology changes a lot of those fundamental human principles, and it doesn't. It should be an enabler, it should be a tool. But when we go back 15,000 years ago, a lot of the social constructs, a lot of the human behavior we have today existed back then. And in fact, in many ways, it was a lot more advanced. We're so obsessed now with this idea that a mobile phone has changed the world, and it's certainly made it easier and faster, but it's only done that for a portion of the world. Right. So when you look at, say, let's pick 3 big parts of the world. So let's say China, India, and Africa as a continent. China's a country, India's a country, but Africa's a continent of 54 territories and states. There's about 1.3, 1.4 billion people in India now. There's nearly 1.4, 1.5 billion people in India. There's 1.4, 1.5 billion people in China. Let's round that to roughly 3.8 billion human beings. A large portion of them don't have access to technology or mobile phone. And most of those people are unbanked. So when we think about a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in Web3 or technically, enabled technologies, that's great for us who can afford the latest phone and the latest technology at our fingertips. And then we have, when we think about our kids, I mean, I've got an 18-year-old son and a 21-year-old daughter, and in their world, Wi-Fi should be free. It should be everywhere like oxygen. And they're not privileged and badly behaved kids. They're just normal kids that grew up in that era. And they didn't, well, they grew up in my family, but this era doesn't know how to read maps. They don't know where north is. If you walk down the street and ask the average person, where's north? Now, there was a time when human beings had to know that because they needed to know where they're going, and they had to know it to tell the time of the day, right? Because if you didn't know where north was, you didn't know where west was, you know where the sun was, you didn't get back to the village, you were left out in the cold, a saber-toothed tiger would eat you. So I do see a world where some of these technologies can dramatically move things forward. Consider for one moment what happens when somebody in a developing space gets their first phone today. It's a 5G enabled phone. The first network they connect with is a 5G enabled network. They never have a physical laptop or PC. They're never going to get a personal computer. It's a waste of space. They have a phablet. They're never going to hit a dial tone. They don't know what AT/DT means on a Hayes modem, right? They don't get a busy tone for dialing into a modem pool. They don't even know what an ISP is. They literally go to a store and get a prepaid phone. It's enabled to 5G. It probably costs, bugger all. And in fact, there'll be a generation of phones very soon where you get a free phone, and that phone comes with $50 worth of credit. Half of that can be used to open up a bank account with one of 5 or 10 bank account apps that are on there. And the other half will be some sort of online trading store. So imagine that I'm in, I don't know, let's just say it's through all of India, and 100 million phones are given to this 1.5 billion population. And every one of those phones are worth roughly $20, $30 each. They're an Android phone, but when you power it on, you don't have to sign up some weird web store. It's already there. And you choose one of the bank apps, and when you open that app up, it automatically creates a bank account for you and gives you $50 credit. Why? Because the cost of customer acquisition is $112 for a bank. So to give you a $50 credit, just get an account, it's half or less, nearly, less than half the cost of customer acquisition. And then when you turn it on, you choose from 1 or 10 different carriers, and they give you $50 of the credit. After you spent that for 3 months, they're hooked, they're not churning. So now you've got someone who's on the network, who's self-educating, who gets a bank account and has a phone account, and they have leapfrogged. It's a quantum leap across everyone else. Now, what's really funny is that person is better connected than you and I. So I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about that. What I'm not excited about is just really dumb shit like Apple taking out charging bricks from phones saying that they're green when that's not. Apple taking a brick out and the charger out of the phone actually created a massive 40% increase in landfill because people had to go and buy third-party bricks and extra chargers and extra cables. And sometimes they bought one that was too slow, so they threw that in the bin and went and bought a faster one. That I'm not excited about. I found it really embarrassing that human beings even think like that because of money. I'm really excited about it getting phones and enablers into people's hands where they can quantum leap what they had before, because all of a sudden they can do things they'd never even dreamt possible that we take for granted. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I love it. I love it all. I mean,
but you still haven't answered me the question of whether the world is going to be on one extreme or the other extreme. What will it really?
I don't think it's either, mate. And we spoke about this the other day when we caught up personally. I think there's an expectation that all the lemmings jump off the side of the hill at the same time, but the reality is that lemmings don't do that in the first place. But no, there's a hope and a dream that decentralized everything and Web 3.0 everything happens, but that just isn't going to be the case. We know that. I mean, when you think about the fact that most financial systems, all airlines, all the bulk of banks, ticketing systems are run on mainframes. This is a 61-year-old technology that, of course, has been modernized every year. I mean, it's interesting that the same year that the mainframe, the current CMOS-based mainframe was launched, was the year that the Porsche 911 came out. But when you buy a Porsche 911 today, it's the latest version of it, right? It's not one that goes way back to the 60s, right? And neither is the mainframe. The latest mainframe is one of the most powerful computing platforms in the world and the single most secure, hands down. There's no question about that. It comes with a blockchain built in, right? And everything's encrypted. Data moving on a mainframe is encrypted whether it's at rest or in motion. Doesn't matter where it is. And you physically can't turn a mainframe on and unlock it. You can't make it unsecure. It's just not what it is. So when we think about where is it going to, there are still places right now. If you book an airline flight, a ticket, whatever, to come to Sydney today, it's on a mainframe. That is centralized. Now, what is decentralized is the front end. Because you use a mobile phone with an app to get to that platform and book the ticket through Webjet or Booking.com or whatever. So I think, to answer your question, I don't believe it's ever going to be all one or the other, any more than I think that human nature changes overnight to be all one or another. I mean, we've got some very confusing times where people don't know what they are anymore, and they've got pronouns that are going insane. But the reality is, if you look at human beings, we're still 2 arms, 2 legs with the same thing, and that's never going to change. No one's going to grow 3 arms. So we've definitely seen distributed technology happen in the last 15 to 17 years and explode, not a Cambrian explosion. So, I don't log into a 3270 mainframe terminal anymore. I don't log into a DEC VT100. I don't go necessarily to a web terminal anymore. I just literally pick up a phone, and that's my terminal, right? And the terminal is an app, and I can run multiple. And I can decide whether I use Chrome or Firefox, or I can use Opera with the built-in security VPN. I can enable Tor, so I can go through the Onion Ring network to be secure. That's my new terminal, but the functionality hasn't changed. It's still technically connecting to a back-end system that's making a booking for me to go on an airplane. And the same system probably is used for taking a credit card payment, right? That credit card payment is not distributed. It's going to a central place. The airline booking is not distributed. It's going to a central place. But the thing that's distributed is the humans using the system and the interface that they use to do that. So I'm very excited about the latter, knowing full well that some of the former stuff still has to be centralized. I mean, when people talk about crypto, for example, and they go on about how it's distributed, actually it's not. The exchanges are very centralized. They're one company, generally with the old school database infrastructure in place for user creation, sign-ons and logons. When I create a user account with an exchange, it doesn't get put on the blockchain. It gets put into a database on a couple of servers with highly redundant environments, maybe in 2 data centers or 2 clouds. That's not distributed. So, right, you've got crypto, which is entirely a distributed mentality, running on centralized platforms. And people hate me for saying that. Like, the number of people who want to punch me in the face for saying crypto is not decentralized, I'm like, so where's the database for your username and password? I'm confused. Even stating obvious things like, the distributed ledgers are not encrypted, and people go, yes, they are. I'm like, no, it's not. The blockchain is not encrypted unless you engineer that in. The data that goes on it can be encrypted, right? So I'm very excited about the distributed format of the front end, but I also know that in reality, you have to have centralization. Mobile phone networks are centralized networks. There are distributed cellular towers that connect to it, but they all bring you back to centralized routers. Something has to make this, something centrally has to decide, can you call me? Right? And that has to happen someone centrally. Are you allowed to connect to my network? Have I got an account? Is my number registered? Can you connect to my number? Have I got enough credit on that to answer the call? That all goes back to one central place. Something centrally has to go, can you talk to me? Now, it might hand off to peer-to-peer if it's through a VoIP type app or something like WhatsApp or whatever, but it still has to ricochet through something centrally. But it's distributed network as far as the edge point's concerned at the thing on the top of the tower that I connect and you do. Right. But without that central thing, it doesn't function. And the same happens to crypto, right? I mean, this is a misnomer that people talk about. So I'm very excited about the distributed element, but I'm also a realist. And I guess it comes to the fact that I've had 3.5 decades in the space that I've come from that centralized space, and we've built distributed elements into it. But I go back to the whole use case thing of like, what is the use case you're trying to deliver, and what is the most sensible thing to do? I mean, putting a piece of a bank on the 8,600 odd, full nodes on the public open mainnet for the blockchain on Bitcoin, that makes no sense. I can't wait 18 minutes at an ATM to see if my credit card can do a transaction. It's not designed for that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But MasterCard is, and Swift is, right? So MasterCard's platform, Visa platform is for sub-second response time. When I type in my PIN, bang, I can tell whether I can get the money out. Right. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm very excited about the distributed capabilities that we're using in the right places. But it does come back to me to that use case scenario of like, what am I trying to solve, and what's the best technology to do that?
You have perfectly answered that question correctly.
Thanks, I'm honored.
The world to me, I think, is going to be a very hybrid. Whatever that
it has to be,
and that does not change, right? The practicality of the users, because that will never change on the front end.
No.
Right.
And that's the case across a lot of things in life, right? So if you and I want to go to the same place in the real physical world, one of us might want to walk because we don't own a bicycle or a car or a scooter. And then another one might use an e-scooter, but the other one might use a push bike. And then someone might ride a motorcycle, and someone might drive a car. I might get on public transport, the bus, a ferry, a train. There are lots of ways to get from point A to point B. And if I can afford it, I'll even just get a taxi to come to my front door. But if I can't, I'll walk the 12 minutes up to the nearest bus and get on that. I might even have the time and make the discerning decision to use public transport because it uses less energy and power, it's less polluting. And so I'll plan in advance to walk the 12 minutes to get to the bus and do the right thing. But if I'm in a hurry or it's the last minute thing, so again, it comes back to the use case, right? If I've got the time and plan, I'll use public transport. But if I'm in a hurry and I poorly plan something and I need to be there as fast as possible, of course, I'm going to use a taxi.
I think so. Sorry to interrupt you. I think to me, at least to a certain degree, it comes down to semantics in a way, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
To a certain extent, like how are you defining, centralized, decentralized, and with all these different, rapidly evolving technologies, everyone's trying to cling to this. Oh, so decentralized. What we're doing here is so decentralized. But if you really do break it down, like what you were just speaking of, I mean, to a certain degree, probably they're not necessarily as decentralized as what they would lead you to believe they are. So I think there's a certain degree of that into it, and I also like that point of the human element to it all as well. I mean, if we're going to go into something like DeFi right now, like the regulatory environments that are going to be, what's going on right now, especially in the US and holding back, and it's just so opaque. Like that's a whole different element and a whole different podcast into itself. But fellas, I do want to shift over into a new segment if we can here.
Just one quick point out if you do though. So keep in mind there's a generational thing, right? So right now there are 6 different generations in working environments, right? So each generation does what it believes is right and what it knows is best. So if you're a teenager now learning to program, you don't learn COBOL unless you want to work on mainframes and earn a fat load of money in banks that can't find COBOL programmers. So we also have to think about the semantics and the nuances of who's making the decision, right? You know, boardrooms are generally full of old people, right? There aren't many 18-year-olds sitting in big boardrooms making big decisions on billions of dollars. So, you know, the older generation make decisions based on their knowledge and experience and with the biases come with that, and younger generation. So if you're now thinking about decentralized finance and you're a new kid starting a startup today, you do that in the context of your experience and knowledge, but you've only ever known mobile phones. Mm-hmm. Right. So you do it from that point of view. But if you take somebody my age and you go, well, actually, we want to build this capability with a service. I'm now going, well, it's not just the programming language I know. It's not just the technology I know. I've got the knowledge and experience to go to the human element and go, what is the thing we're solving for that person? But as a young person, I get so excited going, no, I've just finished my degree. I've learned about learning in Python and whatever. I want to do it with all these open source plugins. You know, so that's a really big thing to be aware of. And as you said, you know, you quite rightly highlighted, there's so many semantics, there's so many things in that to be considered. And that's something that I have to deal with on a daily basis because I hire a lot of people at different age groups and I have to very gently navigate them through the process. Yeah, look, that looks great. I really love that idea. And running everything in Ajax is fantastic. But how does that work in this platform? Or what if the network is offline and Ajax can't talk to me via web interface and tell me that's happened? Can I do the scheduling and queuing? What if my browser crashes and you haven't stored that somewhere? What if someone said no to the cookies and therefore there's no session state in cookies, and when they come back, do they have to log back in? You know, so there's a lot of those little nuances that come with age and experience that we have to be very understanding and mindful that younger generations just don't have because they're young. And we need to know.
Don't forget, we now have ChatGPT, yeah? Adding more complications.
Yeah, we'll come back to ChatGPT.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, so I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
I think we do need to move into a new segment here, and I'm gonna launch us into it right now. It's called the Slurp. It's a quick story relating to your time and experience, I suppose, within this digital space. So I'm really eager to hear what you have for us today, Dez.
Yeah, so let me bullet point it this way. So my experience has been shaped. So I grew up in the jungles of the Solomon Islands and also Papua New Guinea, and my view of technology was $1 million bulldozers and front-end loaders and heavy equipment and ships for logging and freight, shortwave radio. So I was hands-on with technology. And when around about 1976, I was moved to New Zealand to finish high school and college, and I got introduced to kind of more Western cultural things and found computers, and Commodore 64 became my first computer. And I was never into the games. I was always into kind of what can I make this thing do. My very first business was actually writing software for a real estate agency to do distributed copies of their listings of properties for, you know, residential, retail, industrial, etc. And what it taught me was, coming back to your question, was these points in time where there are shifts in technology or societal behavior or design requirement and so forth. And I got very good early on at seeing those. So when in the late 80s, the internet became a big thing, I got heavily involved in being part of bringing the internet to Australia. And then I ran an ISP for a number of years in the 90s, where I wrote a paper back in 94 about what Y2K was going to be and got ahead of that, built a team around it and made it knowing that we had the capacity to do Y2K of big boxes, right? And a lot of companies took us on board to do that. Pre-2000, seeing that sort of the whole web thing was going to become a thing, and watching what sort of, you know, the Netscapes of the world and Mark Andreessen was doing, and that whole thing of software eating the world was like, well, how do we get ahead of this? And then talking to banks about making a front end for web browsers, because that's how the next generation want to talk to them. The banks were like, no, they can just go to the branches and the ATMs. Like, no. You know, and if you spin that all the way forward to when cloud became a thing, I spent 6 years running around the world talking to federal and state governments and businesses saying, the cloud is coming. This is a fact. You cannot stop it. This is a whole new methodology for delivering software. And there will be a point, one of my use cases that I'd highlight was, there will be a point where companies like Microsoft will not sell you software on a USB stick or a DVD or a CD-ROM where you can't download it and install it locally. You can only buy it as a subscription. And everyone poo-pooed, went, no.
That's
6 years later,
right?
Right? Yeah. It's like, you're crazy. Get off the podium, next speaker. 6 years later, everybody that had missed the freight train flooded us with demand saying, help us pivot to the cloud, right? And so there's all that stuff around, you know, the early sort of dot-com boom, and then Web 2.0, and then sort of the shift to machine learning that became AI, and big data, cloud analytics, you name it. There's a long list of those. So I was watching the markets very closely. So getting back to your points of like some of those big pivotal moments, I would see them coming early as possible and get onto there, build a team around it, create a capability, sell out into the market in a consultative fashion, and then go and build things. And so a lot of those were sort of, points in time where I managed to do a lot of things you talked about in the intro, when people look at it and go, that's an impossible list of things to do. Well, if you've got a company that can offer 20 or 30 projects in this space, as you are doing digital transformation for banks, transport, logistics, aviation, state government, federal government, smart cities, education, you name it. And all of a sudden you are doing these big, exciting projects, because digital transformation is the same across them all. For 90% of what we talk about in digital transformation, it's the same across all businesses. And so that stuff got very exciting very quickly if you're quick enough to get onto it. If you're a little bit late, then often I would sort of skip that particular opportunity. So there's a few that we skipped without going into those details, where we realized there's a short lifespan in this, or this is really just a coinage of nonsense. And we would just skip them and focus on the ones that made us money. And then there's other areas where digital transformation just wasn't going to work for time, like aged care homes, for example, and hospitals. 17, 18, 19 years ago, we were sort of talking about, what is now digital transformation, but modernizing IT for hospitals. They just weren't ready for it. That classic Monty Python thing of, I see you've got the machine which goes bing, 90% of those machines in those ICUs pre-2020 still were not connected. People were physically writing down on clipboards, sitting at the end of the bed. My mum's been in hospital 3 times in the last 5 years. We nearly lost her a couple of times. And every time I'd be sitting in the room and a human being would walk in and pick up the clipboard at the end of the bed and handwrite all the things that are on those beeping machines. And I'd sit there going, oh my God, I cannot believe they're doing that. And yet in 2020, I interviewed the founder and CEO of a company who, an amazing lady who had the technology to basically put an IoT style wireless interface securely into all these devices. And so in the 2020s, when sort of non-Asia caught up with what was happening, because most of Asia sort of was hit in 2019, which is why it's called COVID-19. But when the rest of the world caught up and people couldn't go into ICUs, this company called Health Informatics, for example, they were like, well, and they got invested in by Intel. Intel's investment arm said, hey, we'll throw some stuff at you. Let's go crazy. Please use us. Atom P5900 system on a chip thing to make your IoT work. And they had hundreds of ICUs where people couldn't physically go in there. They connected things, put them to a common dashboard. So those big wow moments are things like that, where that is a game changer. That is a lifesaver. And some of the ones that have come along where I've just looked at and gone, that's just a money grab. It doesn't change the world. It doesn't make it better. I'm not getting on board with it. I don't believe in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe on the heels of that right there, I mean, we could slide into this next segment, because I do have a follow-up question that connects to what you're just saying. It's hazy reflections, basically. And I think, oftentimes we get stuck in a moment, our heads in the sand, or we just see what's in front of us. But when we step back and kind of do what you're just doing there, you kind of like look back, we see the trends, see some of the things, our own behaviors, and we've interacted with the market and how these new technological trends have evolved. Are there any parallels to what you're seeing right now in some of these major transformations that you experienced, that you were just explaining a few moments ago, that right now would be ones that, oh no, this is one that, people have to get in on? And I have a few sneaky suspicions of what you might say, but all the same, I'd love to hear from you.
Let me just preface that by something that I've been doing for decades now that actually helps expedite this process. So when you think about some of the big things that are happening, and people are talking about AI now, but often they don't even know what that actually means. In fact, I've actually spoken to people in the last 24 hours that didn't actually know that AI stood for artificial intelligence. They just thought it was something else. They also didn't know that robotic process automation was what RPA stood for. So I'll get back to that question in a moment, but let me just preface this. So there's a process that I use and have used for decades, and I saw somebody do it and I replicate it. And that is that when we work with customers, often what we do is we'll physically take them out of their own offices and walk out the front door and stand on the opposite side of the road and hand them my phone, so they don't have all their phone numbers. So here's my mobile phone. Buy your own product. And you got 1 hour to do it. And if you fail, you owe me a very expensive lunch and a day's worth of consulting. So think about this, without picking on a brand, think about a big tech firm or a service delivery firm, and all of a sudden you're leaving the 42nd floor, you get the elevator down, you go through the security, you walk across the road, you're literally physically staring at your own building, and some idiot hands you their mobile phone. So now you go, okay, so I want to get into sales, so I have to now go and web search that. And then, is this 1-800 the right thing? No, I go into on hold, and then I'm in an interactive voice recording or IVR to push button 5 to go to sales. And then someone says, well, you don't have an account with us, so we need to go sideways. And you can't say, I'm the CMO, connect me now. You've got to, play the game. 99.9% of the time they fail. Now, why is that important? And I'll tell you why. Because if the people that run the business can't buy their own product, how the bloody hell do they expect their customers to do it?
Nice.
Right?
Absolutely right.
So then if you take that and go back to your original question, if you don't mind me doing that little pivot and just to precede this, because that then sets the tone for how I approach these things. We talk about things, used to be things like chatbots and chat GPTs driven people crazy. The thing that annoys me about chat GPT is it only knows stuff within the context of what it's been fed. All right. So when you think about each of these large models, and it's interesting, for people who have tuned in, I invite them to go and web search what Facebook just did. They openly published full disclosure to the best of their ability, for one to understand, all the down to the last details, dollars and cents and hours and whatever, of what they did to build their last large language model. And it's phenomenal. And they showed the carbon footprint, they showed the number of human hours, the number of compute hours and resources. And when you look at that and you step back and go, wow, that is an enormous footprint, enormous debt for the planet that one company's produced to create this thing that can basically just sell me more crap. Right? That's all it's doing, right? Please click on this ad. Now, we've had this for a long time, right? So people talk about big brands, whether it's Google or Bing search engine. Machine learning has powered that from day one. Now, we didn't necessarily call it machine learning. We called it machine intelligence. But when you go and web search something and it makes recommendations, on the ad space at the top and then the regular search engine results pages or SERPs. That's all basically machine intelligence under the guise of machine learning. It's not deep learning. And it's pre-cooked that. It crawls the web, it indexes, it puts it in databases, puts it in distributed file systems, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, even the whole big data wave stemmed from a paper that three people inside Google published around their file system, their distributed compute, which Doug Cutting and Mike Caffarella took on and essentially created a search engine called Nutch. Mike Caffarella went back to uni. Doug Cutting went off and worked at Yahoo and rebuilt their engine based on Nutch. And that was effectively the underpinning element of Hadoop. And Hadoop is the underpinning big data platform for a lot of people enlisted in stream analytics, which in case it's Cassandra and other things. So, you've got the scenario where a lot of these big things that have come about are newer, later, greater versions. But when we think about why are we building these big things like ChatGPT and what are the big costs behind it versus the cost benefit of what am I actually getting out of it? So why are people spending all this money? Well, they got billions of dollars to play with. That's great. But where's the value proposition? Is it just to sell me better ads? Now, if it's a case that it's helping me write articles, that's great. But then there's tools that actually work out whether that article is written by an AI bot in the first place. So if I'm putting my homework forward for this, what's the net gain? Because I use a tool that helps me write the article, but another tool finds out that I wrote the article, therefore I get a fail. What is the point of that, right? Now, if I talk to it now, every one of us, in fact, there's a really interesting little segue here. So every one of us have AI in our hands and don't use it. For example, how many times have both of you used the agent or the bot or the chat in your phone, whether it's Android and Google's tool or whether it's Siri on your iPhone? So when did you last do that? Like, just real quickly, can you remember the last time you physically spoke to your phone or asked it to do something?
Not me.
Billions and billions of dollars have right? But that's
GPT very often, huh?
right. So this thing here, I don't type text on my devices. I don't care whether it's a browser. I use Otter AI for that. In meetings, I literally push the microphone and talk to my phone. I've had to make it quiet now because it normally asks me questions. So we've already got about a decade and a half of that technology in our phones right now. And 99% of people, if you ask them, don't use it. And I'm like, why? It's been doing that for 7 or 8 years. It's had 15 years of billions of dollars investment. So if we build yet a better one, all we're doing is, if you think about these inverted pyramids, like so an upside down pyramid with a very big flat top there coming down to me as an individual, all this money invested to me to be able to talk to my phone, to make a request saying, what's the weather today? Where am I going? Or more importantly, can you explain an idea, which the phone can do today? ChatGPT takes it to the next level. But there's another inverted pyramid now, because like me as an individual, if you do a normal period, there's this huge carbon footprint to get me that 1% of 1% of 1% of value. So I'm at the point where I'm going back to that thing we talked about early on in segment 1 and 2, which is what is the use case? What's the problem it's trying to solve? And I equate it to things like, trying to get to Mars. I consider trying to get to Mars the dumbest thing ever. I think it's great that we're trying to get into space more cost effectively. I think it's bad we're putting a lot of junk into space. But humans cannot exist on Mars. We cannot travel far enough as we are. I mean, it's going to take us 1 million years to get to the point where we can hibernate long enough to get to anywhere near us. And even then, it's going to take 6.1 million light years to get there. So it's like, why are we spending billions of dollars putting stuff into space for someone to go to Mars or put a red car in space When if you walk around most cities, whether it's Sydney, there's 119,000 homeless people in Australia right now. There's millions in America. Why are we not redirecting that? So I get very excited about some of those things, but some of those emerging things I look at and go, great, but where am I going to put that? And I guess that's where sometimes I burst that bubble, which is when I go back through my career path, I'm always looking to solve a problem of things. But I would say 29 out of 30 things that come to me, I'll turn down because I look and think I can make some money out of that, but I cannot buy into what that's for. And I'm not anti-Chat GPT in any way, but I'm still trying to figure out, other than the 1% of 1% of 1% who might write weird stories about it, where are the use cases that really leap out at me, right? And that's the case for automation.
I think that's what everyone's trying to figure out right now. And I also think, to me at least, the way I sort of am reading it right now too, is it sort of represents a sort of illogical approach at times. It's this human element towards technology. It's that big sexy toy that I'm just going to throw money at and just see what happens, just for fun of it. Like, especially if I'm a big company, I've got that the coffers there available. Why not? And I think that's the mentality, and it sort of like tracks back to say like the markets, for something like that, like the way they operate. It doesn't make sense at times. It's sentiment. It's sentiment that's ruling it. And I think in this sense with tech at times, it's just money. It's sentiment. Like, what is ChatGPT going to do? What can it produce? I have no idea, but let's see what it can.
I think it'll do some great things. There's no doubt it'll do great things. It's what great thing does it do, right?
Right.
Sorry, Alvin, I spoke over you there.
Yeah.
No, just like any technology, right? Like if you look at .com, Web2, everyone is throwing money into something, right? Yep. And hopefully, something stick, right? And that you can monetize. And when you look at ChatGPT, right? It's not perfect at this point of time. And if ChatGPT is going to be powered by advertising, and that's dangerous, right? So maybe subscription model, but I'm not sure whether subscription model is going to be able to pay for your computing powers, right? So I think a lot of companies are still trying. You see a lot of Chat GPT and also visual and all kinds of generative AI that's actually out there, and nobody has a clue yet. Everyone is trying something.
No. And I'm all for research.
Right.
Yeah, look, I love research. I think research is fantastic. It's the reason we move forward as a species. But I think what you've both alluded to there is that there's a lot of cheap money looking for quick wins. And a lot of investors, whether it's venture capitalists or private investors, are looking to put $1 in and get $400 back. But I think we've lost sight of this whole thing of, the basic business driver of what problem am I trying to solve. And that's why I highlighted that Facebook announcement where they put out that data, because when you look at it, it's an eye-wateringly large number, and it's an eye-wateringly large carbon footprint for something that doesn't yet have a problem to solve and doesn't yet have a monetization model other than selling ads. And and this is why, when I mentioned before, like when we think about that 3.8 billion people out of the roughly 8 billion people on the planet that don't have a mobile phone, don't have a bank account, if you draw a really clean line, like not a blurry gray one, if you draw a hard black and white line between the haves and have-nots, so the people in the developed regions of the world who just assume they're going to get a new phone every year because that's what their phone company's made available, pay this $89 a month, we'll just send you a new phone on the 13th month and give the other one away. Don't even bother sending it back to us, it's landfill. That versus people at the moment who get one meal a day that's not necessarily regular and don't have access to clean water. The gap between those is so significant that it keeps me up at night sometimes, right? And I'm not someone who's going to say my kids shouldn't have access to great things, but I look at it and go, I am so excited about what some of these things like Chat GPT can do, and not just that one platform. I mean, OpenAI is one of the options. There's dozens of them, and we're now seeing hundreds of them. I mean, like China alone launched something like 400 of them last week, going, oh, by the way, we've been doing this for a while, and there's a couple that are even better. It always reminds me when Lenovo was sort of the thing, when IBM sold their Think brand of laptops and desktops, right? The whole world was shocked when a company came out of China and bought it for cash. The company that bought it rebranded itself as Lenovo. It was the largest computer company in the world before it left China. Everybody in the world, in the modern world, thought IBM was the biggest computer manufacturer, but it was the biggest one they've heard of in the West. But had they lived in China and bought a computer in China, they would have known IBM. Right. Now, I'm not poo-pooing IBM, but there's a view that IBM was the biggest computer company in the world and made the most laptops, most desktops. But then somebody out of China came along and just bought it for cash. Because they were already the biggest computer company in the world. They just never left the domestic borders of China. And then off they went, and now we've got Lenovo. So, there's always these shock moments when something like this comes along and we go, yeah, it's like saying that Elon Musk is the richest person in the world. And that just isn't the case. It's just what Westerners think. There are people in the world who have a lot more money than that individual. They just don't have it publicly listed. And so I think we've got to step back and to something you were talking about a moment ago. It's like, well, what if we stop for a moment and take a deep breath and step back and go, where are we going, right? There used to be this exercise that I love doing in team building, which is you take people into a park or a field, and you start at the edge of the park and you get, let's say it's a circle, and you get everyone around the edge and you make them walk into the center to each other. You count the number of steps, and someone does like 10 steps, someone does 11 or 15. And you go, right, everybody roughly move to where you think the middle is. We know it's about 10 steps. So now everyone put a blindfold on. We're going to spin you around and take 5 steps. But then you have to try and estimate where you are in that circle. And the idea is that if we're all running flat out at something, eventually we're going to hit a brick wall, and we need to stop and go, which direction are we running and why are we running there? And is it the place we need to? And I think going back to kind of, what we're talking about, and I think, Christopher, this is something that you alluded to, which is, are we running in the right direction? Should we be running? Like, Chat GPT hit the ground running, but did it learn to crawl and then walk and then jog and then maybe run and then sprint? Because there's a lot of risks and any technology if it's just gone crazy from day one. And we're not going towards Skynet, but even when you draw a box around Chat GPT, it can only give you information that it was fed, right? Even there was a silly comment made by somebody who was in that space, I forget, but it was one of the model developers who said, maybe our engine is not hallucinating, maybe it's seeing alternate realities. And I was like, no, you're on crack cocaine, right? There's AI, machine learning, is a bunch of if this, then that, else, right? There's nothing that does that. It goes, oh yeah, I'm quantum tunneling through space. The only quantum tunneling done on day to day is what happens between silicon on chips that we've worked out at CPU level. So we need to be very cognizant of these things that you talked about a moment ago, which is, are we going in the right direction, and if so, why and how and when? Because sometimes, for example, for me, I am all for building better space technology when that stuff is pointed back at the Earth and making things better. But it makes no sense to go to Mars. It made no sense to throw a red car into space. That to me is egotistical. And I'm not attacking one individual, but that is just really dumb tech, right? And all that money was funded by taxpayers, right? Government gave money to that company to build that technology and throw stuff in space because they wanted spy satellites or whatever else. But none of that actually really improved the life of a common person on the ground, right? Now, the single homeless person in San Francisco has had a hot meal because we put a red car in space. And that's great if the richest person in the world can do that using taxpayer dollars. But then does that make sense? And I almost think we're not at a tipping point, but we're at a moment where we could just pause. And we could really afford to pause when you think about all the things happening. We're coming out of the end of 3 years of one of the largest pandemics in human history. We're going through significant turmoil in economic and geopolitical. We've got so much xenophobic anti-XYZ from one country to another that it's just mentally unhealthy for people. I've had conversations with people that are so anti-China, and I'm like, why are you anti-China? 99% of what you have comes from there. Like you physically, the telephone we're talking on right now was manufactured there. It's like, for example, people go, oh, it's an Apple iPhone. No, actually, the iPhone's made by Foxconn. It's just branded by Apple, and it's put together in China, right? But, then the company that makes that phone just got India to change the employment laws in India, so that women can work shifts up to 12 hours. Is that making the world better? No, it means that you can get a cheaper iPhone because you cannot afford to get the iPhone you've got if it's made somewhere in America or Australia where people have to get paid full salaries. You can only get that in effectively what is the equivalent of modern slavery, but no one wants to admit that. You can't afford a $1,400 iPhone if it's made in America. You can only afford it if it's made in China or India. So Apple announced last week that they got a region of India to change their employment laws so they could run 12-hour shifts for the women they employ to put your phone together. Now, stop and think about that for a moment. Employment laws for a nation were changed so an American company in Silicon Valley can get phones that are manufactured at silicon level by Foxconn in Taiwan, shipped in pieces to India and put together by human beings as cheap robots, so you can have the next iPhone 15 at sub $1,000. What?
Yeah.
Hang on a second, right? Stop. Hold the phone. No, I'm sorry. No, right? And at the other end of the spectrum, coloring and preservatives are put into meat so it can have a longer shelf life so that somebody can make nastier, cheaper meats to sell you. Because if you cook it and it goes gray, it looks ugly and you realize it's out of date. So that's put coloring in food in. You know, these technologies, they're interesting and they're fun projects, but they are not helping the planet. So I always step back and go, let's take a deep breath, right? Yeah. Changing employment laws in a country to do these things, not a good thing, right? I'm going to get a lot of hate for that, but it's not a good thing. I'm sorry. Better yet, why do you need a new iPhone every year? Right? Why can't we manufacture an iPhone that doesn't die every 3 years? Because you know what? I pick up my Nokia 3110. It's 24 years old. It still works. I actually demonstrated this to someone 2 weekends ago when I came back from Christmas holiday and I caught up with a friend.
Unfortunately, corporate America do not want you to, want us to use it for 24 years.
No, and that's why I guess, Chris, part of your question was like, when we think about some of these big pivots, whether it's the internet boom and we're doing dial-up, whether it's web enabled in the sort of early 2000s, 2004, whether it's right now where I can buy a device and turn it on and everything's installed, all the apps are there, I can it automatically finds a network. I mean, you go and get an Amazon Kindle and you turn it on, all you can do is put in your account details and it uses WhisperNet to talk to every carrier in the world to download all your books that you buy. You don't have to sign up with any carrier. It works anywhere. And even if you're on a plane, it tries to find Wi-Fi in the plane. You don't have to think about it. So that digital book just works. But that's great until you have some lunatic decide they don't like the language in the book. So my ebooks have just had a bunch of updates that I did not approve. I bought a version of Roald Dahl's books, and all of those are getting updated without my agreeing to it because somebody in a part of the world decided they didn't like the language, and then they got the publisher to change it. I bought version 1 of the book and I want that and I want to read it. And I want to read it in my convenience in an electronic version on a Kindle, on WhisperNet, because that's great. What I don't want is the ability for somebody to force the publisher to change language and then inject that new version of the book so I now can't read the one that I bought. I now get some fake woke thing, right? That is not okay. And that's where we need to, as you said, Christopher, we need to stop, take a deep breath and say, is this okay? Because maybe in a state in America, that's something that people subscribe to, but I didn't in Australia subscribe to that. And it is not okay for Amazon to force a download of a revised book. That's not what I bought. That's not the product and service I purchased, even though the EULA says they've got the right to make updates. Sorry, that's just not on. In some countries, that's illegal.
No, like,
does that make sense?
Really behind that idea, yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm really behind that idea of just taking a pause, reconnecting to values. Again, human elements, reconnecting to values. Does this make sense? Is it good for humanity? And I don't think that we're doing that necessarily. Technology, in a sense, is almost replacing religion, right? It's becoming the new god, and like people just worship it blindly and give all their faith into it. I mean, again, that's a whole different podcast. We're approaching about the hour mark. I do want to slide into this very last segment here, Des.
Yeah.
It's the high. It's basically what has you most excited about Web3. And maybe we could wrap this up really quickly. But what would you say to that?
I'm really, really excited about the fact that the cost of acquisition for the end user is coming down to near zero. I'm really excited about the subscription model. And that is that if we are using, as Alvin said, a subscription model, what is the operating format of that subscription model? So can I give you a free phone with apps pre-installed with $50 of the credit, depending on which bank you sign up on, and $30 of the credit on a mobile phone to enable you to join current modern technology society? I'm really excited about the fact that that barrier to entry is coming down to the point where there is no barrier. So like if either of you had kids and they wanted a phone, you can literally just get in your car and drive to the nearest phone and tap your phone, your credit card, and instantly they've got a phone and all the things work, right? And if they had an account on internet banking, or if they had a school account that they've got a username, password, it's usually their email address and a password, they can turn that device on and instantly it will work. So the barrier to entry to that is really just cost. And you can choose a small, medium, large, cheap t-shirt price thing. For $49, I can go to any Woolworths store in Australia and buy the cheapest Android phone with all the apps installed and turn it on and come home on Wi-Fi. I can even go and buy a $49 tablet without a carrier and bring it home and turn it on and connect to Wi-Fi and log into my webmail, and it works. The barrier to entry to that is so low. I don't need to read the manual. It's all intuitive. So I'm really excited about the fact that we are moving towards that space.
Wonderful.
But it goes back to what you're saying before, which is I do hope that we can, as a society and as developers of new technologies, take a pause and go, what if, right? So it's like, the whole idea of, should I get my teenager a gun with bullets in it if I live in a country that allows it to happen? Absolutely not. right? There's no, it just makes no sense at all that a kid has a gun with bullets, no matter what you teach them. But so when I hand them a device and they're on the internet, I've effectively given them a grenade with the pin pulled. Right. And this is, and it's one of the things I often tell people. It's like, if you're putting technology in anything, whether it's your friends, your family, your business, treat it like a grenade that you've already pulled the pin on, and think about how many fingers get blown off if you don't manage that properly. So I'm really excited about the fact that the barrier to entry is coming down. I'm excited about the accessibility. I'm excited about how fast we can pivot. Like, there are whole countries in the continent of Africa that go from 0 to hero overnight when a carrier rolls out 5G and device manufacturers sell very cheap phones. As I said, they're never going to hear a dull tone. They're never going to sit in front of a laptop. They're never going to sit in front of a computer where they've got to push a button to get the CRT screen going. That just isn't going to happen. But then we've got to stop and go, so what does it actually mean?
Excellent.
Do they get more spam? And because they don't understand spam, do they fall prey to spam?
Yeah.
They're all of those things. Yeah. But I'm bloody excited about the future. I cannot believe I'm lucky enough to live in this time. And I'm so excited from what my kids have ahead that I'm able to play a tiny part in helping shape. And having great conversations like this as well is a big part of that for me. I mean, I'm really honored to be the first one to do this for you guys outside your show. But I congratulate you both on doing the show and inviting someone like me on it and other people, because I think these are the conversations that help us shape that and help shape the zeitgeist and the thinking and the approach that we do, that if people stop and hear this conversation go, you know what, that's an interesting point. I haven't taken a breath. Should I just pause for a bit? So I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for accepting to do this session with us. I think you have been very, very informative and also educational. And also, I think, I've been following you on Twitter. Definitely, you have actually imparted a lot of information and also a lot of teaching. I've learned a lot from you. And also, thank you for actually accepting to come on board. And this is our very first, the Milkshake Show. On to you, Chris.
Yeah. I mean, echo that sentiment there. I mean, really, honored to have you on here today, Dez. And we covered a ton. I mean, we went just over an hour here, but I think it's gonna be a treat. It's gonna be a treat for listeners, because we jumped all around, and and I mean that in the best possible way. There's so much information crammed in there. A bit derelict in my duties right now, though. In terms of anyone who is watching or listening to this, hit that subscribe button. Been forgetting to ask that. Hit that subscribe button, please.
Absolutely.
Please.
Give it a like, give it a comment, and give it a subscribe, and tell a friend.
All that stuff.
Tell a friend.
Like in the comment is going to bring up the numbers on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, guys. I've really appreciate it, and congratulations on a great show.
Yeah,
thanks so much. Hopefully I can come back sometime and repeat it and continue the conversation.
Really quick before we sign off, Dez, where can listeners find you, or where can viewers find you?
Yeah, so the simple thing is just Google me, as they say. I hate to sound egotistical, but I'm on so many digital footprints. And my name is Dez Blanchfield. I'll send you a bunch of details. You can put some links in there. But Twitter is where I sort of actively have a conversation. LinkedIn is kind of where I network people. And on all the other platforms, Instagram's where I put my personal photos. Wherever I am, I play to the context of the platform. I don't tend to sort of push business in Instagram, and I certainly don't push Instagram photos in LinkedIn. But yeah, I would love to connect with people. If there's anyone listening, as you said, give it a like, give it a comment, definitely subscribe. But I would invite them to actually tell 10 friends. That's, I think, the way that these shows grow rapidly. Tell 10 friends, send them the link, invite them to listen, and do subscribe. That's certainly how my show has grown. I'd love to have you guys on my show as well as my featured guest soon. But it'd be great to sort of pick up some of the key points here and then have a repeat conversation in 3 months' time and see where are we then and have we moved, kick the tin down the road. But it's been an absolute pleasure. And Alvin and Christopher, I've really appreciated the hour with you guys, and I will definitely be tuning to the next show myself.
Awesome. Thanks, Dez.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks everybody for watching.
Good night, guys.
See you next time. Milkshake Show. We're out of here.
Bye.